Could you tell me something about your childhood, perhaps starting with the first house you remember living in?
Well, I was born in 1924, and because my father was in the Navy, we moved from Gwent, where I was born, to Plymouth. And when we were living at Plymouth, because in those days people didn't buy their own houses, we rented 2 rooms. One was the kitchen and living area, and the other was the bedroom. And I slept in a curtained off part of my mother and father's bedroom. Sounds primitive, doesn't it?
It does.
But that is the way that people lived in those days. So you didn't buy houses, only the rich. And so you just rented places.
Do you think that affected your parents' relationship?
Well, you see, my father, it was a bit different, really, because my father was in the Navy. He had run away because his mother had died, and he had run away and joined the Navy, and was, in fact, in one of the very big naval battles in the First World War, which was the Battle of Jutland. Now, the ships in those days, so he used to tell me when I was little, were run on coal. They filled it up. I presume it would be like a railway engine with coal, and that caused the ship to move. And so when he first joined the Navy, he was about 14, I should think. When he first joined the Navy, that was the way that the ships were run.
So he was away from home quite a
So
lot.
he was away from home quite a lot.
Right.
My earliest recollection, I would have said, was I can vaguely remember my mother taking me to the barracks at Devonport, which is just outside Plymouth, to say goodbye to him, because in those days the naval people or the service people went away for long periods of time. And I should think he must have gone away in about 1929, when I was about 5. And I can remember my mother taking me to the barracks to see him off, because I very well remember her crying. It didn't really, I don't remember it affecting me, but I remember her crying. And so when they went away like that, as a general rule, they went away for 3 years, which is a terribly long time as compared to how the forces go now.
So, in your early childhood, you didn't really see a lot of your father?
No. As well as that, when he went on that time that I'm telling you now, during that period of time, the Japanese and the Chinese were always fighting one another. They were just enemies with one another. And because we had naval bases in both Singapore and Hong Kong, the naval ships went out to try and do a peacekeeping service, really, between the two nations. And because of that reason, my father, at the time that I'm talking about, went away and was away for longer than 3 years.
Do you think that made your relationship with your mother special? Because you were an only child, so you were there all the time.
Well, my mother did everything for me. She was wonderful, because she had no other commitments, because of course in those early days like that, women didn't work in the accepted sense, not in the south of England. I think if you talk to people from the north, where the manufacturing industry was, then you would find that women did actually work. But in the south, it was mainly that you packed up work when you got married. So, no, I don't think it affected my relationship with my mother, but I think it was probably closer because, for one thing, I was an only child. My mother had had a miscarriage a year after I was born, and there was never any more babies after that, so I was in fact the only child. Because she didn't have any other distractions of any description, I think she probably did more for me than some mothers.
Did you have grandparents around?
No, both my grandmothers had died, funnily enough, in childbirth. There was both babies involved with their deaths, because of course, I mean, in those days they didn't have the facilities or the medicines or whatever, and so both my grandmothers I never knew, but both my grandfathers married again, and so my mother had a stepmother and my father had a stepmother. And of course, because relationships were the same really then as now, that is a difficult relationship. My mother was 11 when her mother died, and my father was 9. And so relationships for them at home wasn't very good. And so my father ran away to sea, as I've told you, and my mother went into what they called service in those days, because mainly people of my mother's background went to be servants of some description in what they termed big houses. And so my mother went into service, and she was a cook, what they called a cook general, because she cooked all the things. She didn't just cook sweets or main courses or whatever. She went into a house who wanted somebody to cook generally, and they called them cook generals.
So she worked there before you came along?
Oh, before I was born, yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, she never worked. Well, as we go on to the war, it might be a bit different, but generally speaking, in those days, women finished work when they got married.
So, did you manage to go on any holidays with your mother?
Oh, yes, because my father was a Devonian. He was born in a little place which isn't far from Exmouth called Carisbrooke, and he grew up, his childhood was at Budleigh Salterton, and my grandfather, that's his father, and his stepmother lived in Budleigh Salterton. And so during my growing up time, I went quite often both to Exmouth and to Budleigh Salterton. My father's brother lived at Exmouth, and so I can remember the beach at Exmouth, when I'm from my earliest remembrances, which I suppose would have been about when I was 7 or 8. And so we went there. I mean, it wasn't, you didn't go on foreign holidays, and once again, I can only talk about what we did in the position in life that we were.
Were you financially comfortable when you were in your childhood?
Oh yes, because the naval pay was constant,
Yeah.
not a lot, but constant through a period of time when there was absolutely dreadful unemployment. Because in the early 30s, there was all sorts of unemployment and things happening well industrially. And so my father, although the pay wasn't big, it was regular.
Yeah.
And so no, there was never anything actually that I ever wanted and didn't have within reason.
Did you have any responsibilities within the home with your mother? Did you help her with the housework?
No, I never did anything. But that was probably because I was the only child and she only really had me to look after.
Yeah.
And so I would think that talking to somebody else who came from a large family, that would be a different story. But you're asking me about myself, and
Yeah.
so the only thing that I can ever remember is going errands, fetching stuff that she wanted from the shop, and she used to um, say to me, because food was a very important thing. I think that people, because in those days you didn't hadn't heard about how bad this was for you and how bad that was for you. She used to bribe me because there were certain things that I liked to eat. And she would say to me, "Will you go to the butcher and get 3 pennies?" Now that was 3 pennies old money worth of meat, and I will make you whatever it was that she thought that I would like. And so that was the way that she got me to run errands for her.
At what age did your schooling start?
Well, I started when I was 4, because at that time you didn't have to wait until a certain birthday before you went to school. It all depended really on the circumstances of the school. And I went to school before my 5th birthday, into the infant school. And the other thing that I can remember about early schooling like that is the fact that one playtime I thought that it was going home time, and I went home from school with the little boy, and we turned up on the doorstep in the middle of the morning. But I went to an ordinary infant school which was mixed, boys and girls. And in those days what you generally did was there was 2 buildings, well 3 buildings actually. There was a infants and a junior and a senior school, all in the same place. And so I went to the infant school, and then I went to the junior school, I suppose, when I was 7 or 8, much the same as it is today. And then I took the what became, but wasn't then, the 11 plus exam, and that divided you up into, in Plymouth, into grammar schools or high schools or just ordinary schools. And there was in the vicinity, in the same vicinity as the infants and the junior, a senior school, which was girls only, which I went to because I didn't pass the 11 plus exam, what later became, I forget what they called it in those days, but it was a segregation at the same time as it's done today. But I went to I didn't pass the 11 plus, and I went to the senior school, and we had a very funny way, really, of doing lessons. The headmistress had been to America on an exchange, and she brought a system back which we did, and instead of having lessons, individual lessons, we had what we called an assignment card. And I've never heard of this anywhere else but where I went to school. And we had an assignment card, and that was divided up into months. And you had to do certain subjects during that month whenever you wanted to. You could go for maths, or you could go for geography or history, because I mean it was only just plain straightforward subjects. And the teacher in that particular class marked your assignment card, and so at the end of the month you were judged on what she had written or he had written, because we had masters and mistresses. You were judged on how you'd done in those particular subjects, which I have never heard of, well, certainly not since, but that was the way that we did it. So if you felt like going to a geography lesson, you went to a geography lesson. Of course, you couldn't do that all the time. You had to, in the month, you had to do a lesson in all the subjects, but you could do that lesson whenever you felt inclined. And then they marked you, well, on a sort of B plus, A minus sort of way. You know, I mean, I suppose much the same as you're on today.
And what age were you when you left school?
Well, I was 14 when I left school. That was in 1938. In 1938, I had, of course, the diseases were different then. The things that children had were different then, because, of course, you know, in recent years, medicine has gone ahead in leaps and bounds. And both scarlet fever and diphtheria were very prevalent. A lot of children got them, and at 14, or at least just before I was 14 in 1938, I had scarlet fever very badly, and you went into an isolation hospital, and I was in hospital for a month then. And when I came out, as my birthday is in December, you left school at the time that you were 14. And so I left school when I was 14. And what you mainly did then was, because I hadn't had a secondary school or a grammar school education, you generally went and worked in a shop. Shop assistants were the main thing that you went to, because of course the grammar school people would go into banks and things like that. So you generally went and worked in a shop. And I went to work when I was just after I was 14 in what you would call, I suppose, a sort of department store, but it only sold ladies' dresses and coats and scarves and underwear, and it was on 2 stories. It was quite large.
So in Plymouth?
That was in Plymouth. Now, we lived outside, about 8 miles outside of Plymouth,
What was the transport like?
Well, I used to catch a bus to go to work, or if I wanted to save the bus fare, which I think was about twopence halfpenny old money, I walked.
Walked 8 miles to
That's
work.
right. Because walking was nothing in those days.
What were the hours like?
Well, they were long. As far as I can remember, I would think it would be about from 9 in the morning till 6 on an ordinary day, but Fridays and Saturdays was 9 o'clock at night. So you worked from 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. At the weekend. I mean, that was just ordinary.
Did you have a day off in the week?
Yeah, afternoon. You'll find that most towns had their afternoon closing day. I mean, Haverfordwest had Thursday, well, in Plymouth it was Wednesday. So I didn't work Wednesday afternoon off. Now, for a week's work, like I'm telling you, I earned 7 shillings and 6pence, which I suppose you would take back to about 37 pence in the new money. But I paid my bus fare when I went on the bus, and I bought clothes out of that, and paid my mother. Well, I used to give her money, but she used to give it to me back, because we had a system in the shop that you took the clothes when they came in, and we're talking about fashionable clothes, and I lived in a town, so it was quite fashionable. You took them home on what they called APRO, which was for approval, short for approval. And you took them home on APRO and looked at them and tried them on, and then you went back and bought them. Now, I would think that was because I worked in the shop, but I would have imagined that there were customers who also bought took goods home on approval. And I started work in 1938, and of course I suppose that would have been about the beginning of 1938, and then of course I worked there like that until war was declared in 1939, September 39. And I can remember very well Neville Chamberlain announcing us all listening, although I didn't really realise the gravity of it, not at the age that I was, but I remember hearing him saying that we had declared war on Germany. And my father, who, as I've told you, was in the Navy, had finished his time, because they, do periods of time in the services, the same as they do today. And he had finished his time in 1938. But like I said to you, that unemployment was bad in the 30s. And when he came out of the Navy, he couldn't get a job. And so they had what you call a reserve Navy, which I suppose they knew that things weren't very good in Europe, and so they had this reserve fleet ready. And I suppose it would have been about the July of 1939, the King, who was George V, was doing a review of the fleet. And so my father went in this reserve fleet for the King to review them then, that was to inspect them. and he was already at sea when war was declared, and of course my mother and I were in Plymouth. By this time we'd moved from the two rooms that I told you about. I suppose I would have been about 10 or 11 by the time we moved, and we moved into a two-bedroomed house, still rented, of course, because like I said, people just didn't buy houses, although later on my mother did try and buy it, but I think it was about £350, the house, and of course she had a job to raise that. Well, they couldn't raise that sort of money. I mean, that was a lot of money in those days. And so we'd moved into this two-bedroomed house. And that would have, that had a kitchen where the stove and that was, and a toilet, and a living room, and what they called in those days a front room, which we'd never used except on very special occasions, and two bedrooms, so by this time I had my own bedroom. Well, when war was declared, my father was already at sea, and so I didn't see much of him, during that period, once again.
Did you live in Plymouth throughout the war?
Well, we stayed in Plymouth then, and of course they issued us with air raid shelters. Now there were two sorts of air raid shelters. An Anderson shelter, which was like corrugated iron, and you dug a hole down in underneath the ground, a big hole, and you put this corrugated iron like the army huts, round like the army huts, the corrugated stuff was. And then on top of that you piled earth, because presumably that stopped, to a certain extent, blast. And so there was an Anderson shelter and there was a Morris shelter. Now I would presume that they were named after the people who invented them. And the Morris shelter was like a great big cage that you had in the room, in the living room, which you used as a table, really. But in the case of an air raid, you crawled in underneath and stayed in there until the air raid was over. Now we had neither of those, as it happened, because my mother, where we lived, the house that we lived in, we didn't have a garden, we just had a courtyard. But my mother was very friendly with a lady that lived across the road who was living on her own, and so she invited mother and I, because of course Dad was away all the time, to use that shelter with her. And so of course there wasn't much going on in the beginning of the war. It was very quiet. I mean, there were things happening to soldiers, and I mean, I don't remember much about things like that, because you see, once again, you know, the newspapers and things weren't the same as they are today, and news took longer to come, and you know, I don't remember. In the back of my mind, I suppose I remember about them bringing the troops and that from Dunkirk, but you know, I couldn't consciously tell you about that. But I do know that later on into, I suppose that would have been about 1941, the air raids had started, and of course London had been getting dreadful air raids, but not much was happening in other towns and cities. But I suppose it would have been about 42-ish that we started having air raids in Plymouth. And what used to happen really was that you went to work, and when you came home you had your meal and you immediately went to the shelter and stayed in the shelter all night.
Was there a lot of air raids going on there? Was it every night?
Well, what they seemed to do, looking back on it, was to concentrate on a city until they had bombed it very badly, and then they moved on and did the same thing to other cities in other places. And so I suppose that really the main bulk of the air raids in Plymouth were all at one particular time, and it was very badly burned and bombed because of course the fire engines and fire service then went all over the country wherever the air raids were taking place. And Coventry had been bombed very badly, and the firemen who came to Plymouth had also fought fires at Coventry, and they said that the fires in Plymouth were very much worse than ever anywhere, because what they did was to drop what they call incendiary bombs, which were small but started fires instead of actually killing people. Well, I mean, they did kill people, but I mean, that's what they dropped mostly in Plymouth. And as I've told you, we lived about 7 miles from Plymouth itself, and you could read a newspaper out in the street by the light of the fires that were going on in the city. And just opposite where I live and where I was in the air raid shelter, there was a direct hit, and 3 houses were flattened and 7 children were killed in those 3 houses. And of course, wherever you were, if you were able-bodied, and of course you must remember that I was young, you went and tried to do what you could in the location in which you were. And I tried with the fire people and the ambulance people to get those children out, but they were dead. They weren't alive because the bomb had hit directly on the house. And that was only just one instance. I mean, I wouldn't like to tell you how many people were killed in Plymouth, but I mean, it was enormous, because Plymouth is quite, or was, well, and is, quite a big city.
Did it affect you personally then?
Yes, I think it did. I think that, well, I think it's bound to shape your life, that sort of experience. I think that brought home to me at that time, and at a young age really, because we're now, I'm only 16 or 17 still, and I think that yes, it's bound to have affected the way that you think, because I mean, it was horrendous really. I thought about it because, of course, I knew that I was going to talk to you about it, and I've thought about it a great deal. You don't, of course, think about it after 50 years, normally, but I have thought about it a great deal since you said about talking about it. And I mean, war is so horrendous that it should never happen like that. and certainly not to civilians.
Did you lose any relatives in the war fighting?
No,
No.
no, none at all. My father, who of course was in several different places, was very, very lucky. He was in the patrols because, of course, you must realise that Britain being an island, we had to depend on everything coming by sea. And so they used to have the Navy patrolling, the merchant Navy, bringing goods into Britain because that was the only way that we could survive. And my father was in the Russian convoys, which were dreadful because it was so very cold. And he lost 3 ships altogether in the time during the war. And so, although, nothing happened to him in that sense, he was hurt because he was bringing people from the island of Crete, evacuating troops, our troops that were in Crete. And they bombed they sunk the ship that the soldiers were on, and there was several regiments of soldiers and the ship's crew, and my father was about one of 20 or 30 people who survived. And not only did they bomb the ship, but the Germans machine gunned the men in the water. And the only thing that my father, the only way that he was hurt was he had a bullet in his elbow because he was in the water. But he was a strong swimmer, and although he was reported as being missing, he wasn't actually. He'd been picked up, but of course, everything was so confused with people all over the place that it took some considerable time before they could tell my mother that my father was alive and well. And that was another thing that I really ought to tell you about, because during the time that the air raids were going on in Plymouth, people decided that they would go out and go and sleep somewhere outside the city in order to escape from the actual bombing. And you just went to somebody's house, just got on a bus and went to somebody's house, and they put you up for the night. When I think about it, it's incredible, really, because my mother then and I went to a place outside Plymouth, and what we found was that the guns that were trying to bring the aeroplanes down were in the next field to where we were sleeping, and so it was far worse out there. And in that time, during the time that we went out there, they brought a plane down in the next field to where we were. So we really didn't escape from the bombing at all. It was far worse out there than it was, in the town where we were. And when we were coming back from there one morning, my mother had a newspaper, and it said in there about my father's ship having been bombed. And I can remember how upset she was, and it's only in later years did I realise that I wasn't really much help to her, because I was young, and I suppose you think of different things, your thoughts are different as you get older. But it was very terrible time. And to be in a place like Plymouth, which of course was an important port, and so you know, a lot of the bombing took place there.
What would you say the morale of the people were like in Britain
Wonderful.
at that time?
Wonderful. Because I think the British people are like that. I mean, if you've got some sort of tragedy or disaster, I mean, you know, it's the same now, isn't it? When there's floods or earthquakes or whatever it is. I mean, people tend to be a lot friendlier and I mean, going backwards and forwards to work during the time of the air raids, you know, I mean, everybody, spirits were wonderful. Of course, it affects your feelings towards the Germans, for instance, because I suppose, like I said, having been born only really 6 years after the First World War, which was absolutely dreadful as far as manpower was concerned, I suppose all my growing up life was spent, you know, hating the Germans, I suppose you could say. It was as bad as that. It was a sort of inborn thing, because of course my mother only had one brother, and he was in the army during the First World War, and of course they used gas in that war. The troops, of course, fought hand to hand, which was a bit different than the Second World War, where, you know, it was a lot of the war was done with bombing and things like that. But in the First World War, they did a lot of hand to hand in trenches and things. And my uncle was gassed during the war, and he was, you know, he never worked after. I mean, I remember him, of course, and he never worked. And so I suppose because of that feeling that I grew up with, and then when the Second World War came, I suppose it colours your attitude towards people. Not the young people today, because, you know, but when you think of all the dreadful things that went on during that time, although once again I've been asked quite often, were we aware of concentration camps and things like that? No, I wasn't. I mean, I suppose perhaps if you were Jewish or Russian or whatever, then you might have been aware of them, but I personally wasn't aware of them until, of course, the Americans and the British troops, well, not only British, because of course, you know, what you've got to remember is that we had colonies in those days. I mean, the Canadians and the Australians and people like that fought. And so it was only when I saw photographs in the newspapers of them liberating those camps did I really realise the absolutely dreadful things that went on there.
So there's nothing reported in newspapers or anything about concentration camps before the end of the war?
Well, not that I read. But then, you know, what you're asking me is that I think that young people are different today. I mean, I was quite young, what I would call young. I mean, I didn't think about serious things like that, really. And, I mean, perhaps it was there, and perhaps it was that I personally didn't read it, but no, I didn't. I wasn't aware of it until, of course, the terrible pictures of Belsen and places like that when the actual troops got there to liberate it.
How were you affected by rationing?
Oh, well, that was dreadful, really. I mean, when you come to think about it, I suppose it's a gradual thing, you see, rationing. But like I said, rationing is a sort of gradual process, and I suppose you don't realise about it until you manage with one thing and then you manage with another, and people did. I mean, it was incredible, really, because I remember there was one anniversary since, and I got a box. We were doing some sort of social event, and I got a box and put the stuff in exactly as it was, during the rationing period. And I mean, I found it incredible how we managed on that, because I mean, we had to, that was all you had. And of course, I mean, that went on for years, because rationing, in fact, well, your mother was born in 1951, and there was still sweet rationing and that sort of thing then, although the war had finished in 1945, because of course, once again, you've got to remember that things took a long time, and the actual change in life, I could say really that you could divide, people that lived through the war could divide their life into how it was before the war and how it was after the war, because things altered completely after the war. I mean, I think what really happened was that there had been so much unemployment. I mean, I didn't know it. I never experienced it, but your grandfather's father was out of work for years and years and years, and so all they lived on was unemployment benefit. And of course, I mean, that wasn't like it is today, and they means tested that. They came around and decided how much you could have on your circumstances. And I know I've heard him saying that because he worked in, or lived rather, in a country area where you could get chickens and things like that, their benefit, their unemployment benefit, was a great deal less than people in other places where they wouldn't have that advantage. And so life was altogether different. The men, when they came back after they had fought the war, were determined that circumstances for them, and that's the working man that I'm talking about now, in inverted commas, decided that it was never going to be like that again, and that they were going to make it different. And of course, that is basically why, although Winston Churchill had been such a great man during the war, because he was a great orator, and so when he made speeches, he geared everybody up to those speeches, and so he was a man for the time.
Mm-hmm.
But having said that, of course, when they came back, there had been a disastrous Labour government early on. I think that would have been round about the time that I was born, and they hadn't been very successful. But when the men came back from the war, they were determined that there was going to be differences, and that was really, I think, the reason that so soon after they came back and were what they called demobilised, that they were determined that there would be a change of government, which there was. And so that was where the early health service started, because during my growing up period, of course, you couldn't afford to be ill. I mean, we were okay, but there were people that couldn't afford to go to the doctor, because you had to pay to see the doctor and you had to pay for medicines. And so I think that because that all that had gone on during that period of time, the men who had fought and won the war and done such a good job decided that that life was going to be different. And that was why, so soon, I think it was only 1945 that the election was, that that they didn't vote Winston Churchill straight back in.
Yeah.
Because of course during the wartime, they had what they call a coalition government, which was part the best of the Labour men and the best of the Conservatives, and they had run the country on a war footing between them. And then of course, naturally, when it was over and done with, they wanted to go back to their principles, which of course are totally diverse. But it was certainly a different life. It was never the same. Perhaps for me it was because that was childhood, and I was a young woman, and then by the time the war was over, I was a married woman. So I married in 1945, and so all circumstances were different then. And of course we had a very bad start, really, because I've told you that there were certain diseases which were bad in those days, but there was no cure for. And in 1945 I found that I had TB, and of course that was the biggest killer of young people at that time that there's ever been. And I was very lucky because although what happened was they had what they called a mass radiography thing, which they came round all of the places that you worked, and they did x-rays and put them onto what was then very modern microtape. And so they came round and they came to factories and all that sort of thing. And I worked in a factory that made propellant, which was part of the war effort, really. And they came there and they took all these photographs of everybody. And then if they looked at them, and if they thought there was something wrong, then they sent for you and they did a proper x-ray. And of course they found that I had TB. By the time that that had happened, there was no real cure at all. And I went into hospital in 1946. And you stayed in hospital in those days. Well, I was in for a year. In hospital for a year.
What were the conditions like in the hospital?
Well, I was a bit unfortunate because the hospital that I went to was in fact the same hospital that I had gone when I had scarlet fever. And so it was a hospital that was geared to contagious diseases. And so you were only allowed to talk to your visitors through a window. You didn't actually see them. They came and stood outside and talked through a window because I suppose they thought that was the easiest way to not spread all these fevers and things, because you must remember that they didn't have inoculations and things like that in those days. And so when I went into hospital first with TB, I went into this fever hospital, and we were only allowed visitors half an hour on a Wednesday and half an hour on a Sunday. And I stayed there for 6 months, and then they sent you to a sanatorium. They called a sanatorium, and the one that I went to, because I was living in Plymouth at the time, was a sanatorium at South Brent, which is out on the moors, which is very, very cold. And the places that you slept in had no walls at the front. They were completely open, closed on 3 sides, but that part of it was open, because they used to send people to places like Switzerland, because obviously the cold air.
So it was open to the outside?
Yes. Open to the outside. I mean, it was within the hospital premises, but I mean, it was open to the outside. And you were confined to bed then in the first instance. But later on, during the time that you supposedly improved, you went in what they called huts, which was like a garden hut. And you had a bed in there, and you slept in there. I suppose, as I said, I suppose it was all to do with the fact that the cold air was supposed to kill all the germs. But I mean, it was frightful, because 1947 was the worst winter ever. I mean, people up to that time said that there had never been a winter, or never reports of a winter as bad. And certainly, as far as I'm concerned, in the years that I can remember, there has never been a winter like it. Because the snow started in December and didn't clear until March or April, and was well over the hedges. I mean, it was 6 or 7 foot deep in some places, and of course, like I said, we were on Dartmoor, really, which was one of the worst places to be. And so I stayed there, and presumably, although once again I didn't know it, I went home because there was no more treatment that they could give me. But by the time I had to go back in hospital again, by that time an injection called streptomycin had been found, which was wonderful. And of course it cured tuberculosis, which was absolutely wonderful, because it had been a terrible disease, and mainly affecting young people. So I was very lucky, because as the years have gone on, and so much has altered in my lifetime, so many new drugs, and certainly a great deal in televisions and radios and things like that. I mean, of course, when I was first married, we listened to the wireless. There was no such thing as television. I mean, television came in as far as the general public were concerned, in the 50s. And we were one of the first people to have televisions, and people used to come for an evening to look at the television, if you had a television set. And of course, the way of life, those sort of things influence the way that life has altered, really. Because I mean, in those days we didn't watch television or listen to or watch videos and things like that. I mean, we either read or listened to the radio, well, the wireless as we called it. It was a radio today, but it was a wireless in those days. And so, looking back over the years, so much has altered. So many things have influenced the time. And I mean, during the war, of course, skirts, for instance, were short, mini skirts, because of the saving of the material, which is influenced by the war. And in 1948, we had what they called the New Look, which came out, which the skirts were nearly down to your ankles, because once again they were all trying to get away from the influences of war and the fact that stuff hadn't been able to be used for those things, were used for the war effort, really. Because of course they came round and collected all, like, pavings and railings, and melted all that down to make ammunition. So if you had, like, railings, you know, you see railings sometimes these days now around parks and things like that. Well, sometimes the houses would have railing, little brick wall and railings on the top. Well, they came and collected all that and melted it down to make ammunition, because of course, you see, what had really happened was that we weren't prepared for war. Germany had been preparing, and that was where Hitler came from, really, because he was wonderful for the Germans, and he had been preparing for war for all the years between 1919 then and 1939. Well, not him only, but the German nation. But we were terribly unprepared. I mean, the Home Guard was formed, of course, in the beginning of the war, which was the men who were still at home and not gone into the forces. And there wasn't guns or anything for them. There wasn't enough ammunition and stuff to give to them. So they just had sticks and things like that, which presumably you were supposed to defend yourself with if an invasion came. But of course, you know, an invasion never came. I mean, Hitler's biggest mistake, of course, was that he didn't invade in those early, when I was saying about the air raids in the early 40s. If he had invaded at that time, and it's always seemed a mystery to me, because, you know, he got as far as the Channel Islands. I mean, the Channel Islands were occupied, which is really no distance away from us, but he never carried on and invaded. And I think that probably the world would have been totally different if he had done that at that time, because we were totally unprepared.